feel happier and joyful and like, things were finally opening up and a new day had dawned and all that crap. And instead, maybe you're feeling anxious and insecure and irritable and all the crap your partner's been doing for 6 months that you thought was charming. Suddenly you can't stand it. What's going on there? Well, it turns out that's a real scientific phenomenon, and there's some stuff you can do about it. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about reopening that's happening right now, notably in Texas, Connecticut, and other states. And is it the right thing to do? And if it is, how do we make sure we do it safely? Today on Apocalypse Prep. My name's Mitch, and this is Apocalypse Prep, the show that gets your people and your community ready for anything. All right. So we're in this place where you've heard vaccinations are coming. Maybe you've already gotten one. Maybe it's happened for your family, for your parents, something like that. You see yourself getting closer in line. The weather is getting warmer. And it starts to feel like we can see the end of this thing. Now, I want to caution from a public health perspective, I don't know that we're there yet. We've got variants going around. We're kind of in a race between vaccination and these other more contagious, sometimes more severe variants. But there's this feeling, right? This feeling of newness. There's a lot of vaccine capacity. New mass sites are opening up. People are talking about reopening. And we expect to feel happy about it, right? We expect to feel that something new is happening and maybe our lives will get back to normal. And instead of feeling happy, that thought is sending a lot of people I know, I've had this conversation like a dozen times in the past few days, into this anxiety spiral. There's this insecurity. Can I get my life back together? How am I going to make it through these next things? A lot of things that haven't been bothering people for a while suddenly are, like my partner never puts the dishes away or the laundry isn't folded right. And we've been doing this for 9 months and I didn't think it bothered me. And now all of a sudden, all of this stuff is like banging on my brain all the time. And I'm anxious and I'm insecure and I'm tired of my kids and I want to get out of this place and I can't. And all of it for some reason is worse and not better because we might see the end in sight. So this is a real thing. In disasters and other phenomenon. It's called the third quarter syndrome. Hat tip to my friend Kelly McKinney for reminding me of it when I saw an article he put on LinkedIn. It's this idea that when you're about 75% of the way through something that's an ordeal, something severe, at that point, your brain starts shorting out and you can't handle it anymore. So let's talk about why, and let's talk about what we can do about it. So back in 1976, there was this researcher, and his name was Robert Bechtel, and he published a set of studies on people in cold places. And there's a lot of data that came out of that study that was published, but there was something that he didn't write up, something that bothered him, but that he couldn't prove. And he thought about it for 10 years, wondering what he was going to do with this piece of information. And the information was that it wasn't in the height of winter, when it was coldest, that the worst things seemed to happen. It was in February, right when it seemed like the group was most of the way through the winter, whether this was in Antarctica or at the McMurdo Station in Alaska, in the Arctic. Suddenly in February, domestic violence calls would spike up. People stopped showing up to work. Illness rates started going up. People became antisocial. There was this February syndrome, and he couldn't figure it out. But there wasn't enough data to prove it. And over those 10 years, 1976 into the mid-'80s, this phenomenon started showing up in other places too. Nuclear subs, where people were underwater for 100 days, like 5 or 6 days before they would surface, before their mission was over. Tempers started flaring all over the place. Mars society things, these things where people build a bubble and they all live in it to pretend they're on another planet. Those things would go great, like the first 5 months. And then that last month, it would be this potboiler of stress and anxiety. So finally, in 1991, Robert Bechtel and Amy Burning wrote a paper in this book From Antarctica to Outer Space, talking about all of these severe scenarios that people were living in. And they proposed this thing called the third quarter syndrome. And they proposed a reason, which was, you've been going through this, you've been using all your emotional resources to get through this severe scenario. And suddenly you look up and you realize, this might end. And when it ends, it's not like I'm going to have a vacation, right? When it ends, I have to transition back into some version of normal life. And what your body does is it kind of takes some coping resources and it kind of puts them away in like an emotional closet or something. It's like, when that happens, you're going to need resources to deal with that transition. And it takes away those coping resources from you now, kind of puts them in a bank for later so you can handle that transition. And suddenly that energy you had to cope with, the kind of dreaded now of the waking up and living life in your kind of lockdown situation, not seeing people, that all goes away. And when you lose that coping syndrome, it spikes the anxiety and it spikes this insecurity. It spikes this worry about the transition. It spikes annoyance at kids and people in your family and friend circles. And it's this incredibly kind of a painful thing. And the author said, you know what? We don't really know how to get through it. And since then, there's been some work on that. On what it takes. And the thing is, part of the issue is that you are actually losing solidarity. For a long time, despite all the tensions in the country, at least a lot of folks, the majority of folks, have been feeling this kind of solidarity as we've gone through this thing together. But now, as the country's coming out of it in different waves, that solidarity starts to kind of break open. And so the question is, how do we sustain it? Now, something people might not know is we think about our country as kind of the height of democracy and freedom here in the United States. But there's this global organization called Civicus that monitors this stuff. And they do kind of real-time reporting. And from their point of view, we're not actually an open and free democratic society right now. We are a restricted, obstructed society where our civic society isn't working. Now, it's probably no surprise if you're watching this that our civic society isn't working that well, given the stuff that's gone down recently. But the point is that in obstructed societies, you see a lot less solidarity. We don't stand together. It's more fragile and breakable. And so we've done much worse than other countries have at this feeling of being cohesive together. And that means that our third quarter syndrome, it's going to be that much worse because we don't have that solidarity to hang on. Like we don't have that community sense the same way other countries have because of all the divisions that we've got. So the question is, what do you do? How do you get from the third quarter to the fourth quarter when you're feeling this anxiety? Well, there were these researchers who went through the Virginia Tech massacre, a terrible school shooting that happened a number of years ago. And James Hawden and John Ryan studied solidarity after that event. For more than a year, they tracked it. And they looked both at how you create this cohesion in a community, things like public funerals and convocations and mourning events, that kind of stuff. And then they looked at how you sustained it. And they found three findings that I think are really important. Number one, you sustain it through continued public rituals, getting everybody together to associate togetherness with the meaning of something that happened. Two, you sustain solidarity through just connecting with the wider community, just regular life, going to restaurants, going to church, going to clubs, those sorts of things that are really difficult for us during the pandemic. And the third thing they found was that for people that were grieving, going to therapy was actually inversely correlated to solidarity, which means that if you dove into therapy for your personal grief, you tended to have a more fragile relationship with your community, right? So, and that's because this feeling of the third quarter syndrome is about connection and the fragility of it, being connected to these particular people and networks in lockdown, knowing those connections might sever or break, your relationships with your pods might change or go away as we move into a normality that we don't really know what it looks like, if it's going to come, if it's going to be normal at all. These anxieties are about connection. So we have to look at how we can heal them as a community, not necessarily as individuals. All right, so that's my sermon for you. What's my advice? I'm going to put my emergency manager hat on, and I'm going to tell you a couple of things. One, it's been about a year we've been doing this in this country, about a year. And we should memorialize that with your pods, with your family and friends. Have a vigil, have a candlelight ceremony, do some Sunday school, have a dinner where you share some food and tell stories. Have a ritual that commemorates the grief we've all gone through this year and all the tragic stuff that we've lost. It's going to help you feel that you're moving from the third quarter into the fourth quarter, or at least that you're preparing for what happens next. Second, connect with folks beyond your friends and family. Get out of that bubble that you've been in. Now, in some places, it may be safe to go to a restaurant, safe to meet, a friend at a bar while eating food and masked. And in other places, maybe you connect on Zoom. Maybe you need to go to Zoom church. Maybe you go to clubs. I stopped a lot of that stuff personally because I couldn't stand doing it on Zoom, but we need those connections. I'm trying to start to reach out to people again beyond my bubble, because those connections help to give us a bridge back to the solidarity we need to get through this. And then this is not me saying you shouldn't do therapy. I mean, therapy is really great and helpful. I'm doing that right now because of all the grief we've all been working with. But just know that therapy is something that is there as an individual, and it doesn't help this issue because this issue is about connection between people. So you want to make sure that it's not just therapy. You're working on connection too, because third quarter syndrome boosts stress and anxiety because of these fragile connections we built that might break and be reformed in different ways. And we've got to solve that as a group. You can't solve that as a person alone. So third quarter syndrome. It's real. It happens in all kinds of scenarios, not just COVID, but us in lockdown, looking at whether we're going to come out of it based on the choices that we make, are feeling a real sense of stress and anxiety. I want to validate that. It's real. It's going to be part of your life for a little while. But I also want you to know that vaccines are rolling out. There are rational decisions being made about reopening. The third quarter will become the fourth quarter. It's still going to be a long time. We're pulling through, but I want you to know that you're going to get through it. All right? So don't knock your partner on the head with a cast iron pan just because you don't like the way they're washing the dishes. Know that it's something that's happening to you, and it's probably happening to them too, and it's time to reconnect rather than break down. So one more thing that I want to talk about. So in the news right now, we're seeing a lot of discussion about reopening. And it's getting conflated, right? People are distilling it down into sound bites. But I want to make a couple of points about what is helpful and what isn't based on where we are right now. And in particular, let's talk about Texas and Connecticut, because there's all of this news interest. It's March 10th right now. Over the last couple of weeks, Texas, along with Mississippi, announced 100% reopening, no more mask mandates. And then a bunch of the media jumped on them for doing that. And then a few days later, Connecticut announced a reopening. And then a bunch of the right-wing media said, haha, look at your little blue state doing it too. So let's look at the details, and let's talk about how we do something like reopening in a rational, public health centered way. So Texas, when they reopened 100%. No more mask mandates, no more capacity restrictions whatsoever. If you look at Connecticut's plan, which is similar to a plan for Massachusetts and other places, first, they kept the mask mandate in place. And second, there's a clause in their reopening that says you can open at 100% capacity if you're a restaurant. There's still restrictions on sports venues and things. If you're a restaurant, you can open at 100% capacity as long as you can meet social distancing rules. And what that means is, for most restaurants, that isn't actually full capacity. It's the capacity they can achieve while still keeping folks that aren't together 6 feet apart. Right? So in the news, it's kind of like 100% capacity in Texas and Connecticut, but the way that capacity is measured is really different, and that's important. And the reason that's important is because way back at the beginning of this thing, we talked about social distancing, as a voluntary snowstorm, everybody taking responsibility for everybody else, and wearing face coverings after an initial waffling, like let's all admit there was waffling there, wearing face coverings not to protect yourself, not to wear some kind of sophisticated N95 that will keep all the virus from reaching you, but wearing them to protect each other. That's why masking can't be a personal decision that everybody makes, because it's not a decision for your own health. It's a decision you're making for other people's health. That's why we've got to choose to all do it as a community. And those two things are actually the most significant public health interventions we have seen during this pandemic. Several studies have come out. It's not closing schools. It's not closing restaurants. Bars saw a lot of uptake, right? So let's kind of leave bars aside because there's a lot of virus stuff. But if you manage an environment where you can socially distance in masks, you can alleviate a lot of the economic pain from closures if everybody will do it. Right? If we convinced everybody to wear masks, the closures wouldn't need to be nearly as severe because we would protect each other. So in part, it's the resistance to mask mandates that, in my opinion, have caused some of the economic harm we've had to survive from closures. So that's a lot of stuff to say this point, which is here's where we are. We're not out of the woods. We have a baseline right now of 60,000 to 70,000 new infections a day. In New York City, it's still 4,000 new cases a day. That is substantial. And we've got a vaccine rollout that's still barely getting started. And we've got a number of new variants that are coming in that are more contagious and more severe than the ones we've seen before. On the other hand, we've learned a lot. We've learned what works and what doesn't. We've learned that schools are by and large safe if they're given adequate resources for care and teachers are considered essential workers. And we've learned that closures aren't as effective as masks and social distancing. So what I want to say to you is, even if you're vaccinated, per the CDC recommendations, if you're going into a public space, keep wearing a face covering. Keep doing it to protect other folks, even as things open, because this isn't a light switch. It was never a light switch. It was always meant to be a dimmer that we turn off and turn on. So we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, so we're starting to turn things up. But the last things we should turn off are social distancing and masking, because they are the most protective for the least economic cost. It's an important lesson, and it's one, whether we're in the third quarter or the fourth quarter, I want to make sure you don't forget. Send in your questions. I'll talk to you next week. Take care.